So moving on to think about some of the teaching approaches we can use in the classroom to promote empathy and historical imagination. I'm going to start talking about some of the ideas in the Endicott and Brooks article. And I think because they make some useful practical suggestions for starting points. And I think one of the most important things they remind us is that we need to root the work we do in source work as a really useful way into developing empathy. So their advice is to use primary sources which provide insights into individual lives, but they move beyond just thinking about traditional written sources. So we've got diaries and journals, letters and postcards, photographs, speeches and publications. So we can use a wide variety of primary sources. And then when we are doing that, we need to think about the kinds of questions that we construct to enable students to use those primary sources to develop empathy and empathetic understanding. So we need to really help the students to focus in on the relevant aspects of the source and to think about them in relevant ways. So here are some examples. What does the source tell you about how the author may have perceived their life? How might this information have influenced the historical figure's thinking? For comparing sources. And then questions like, what would be important in this painting to this particular historical figure? So we're beginning to, by thinking about the relationship between sources and relating them back to an individual's life, we're beginning to encourage people to make judgments from that person's perspective rather than just to project themselves into that situation. So in relation to the selection of sources, Harris and Foreman Peck also make the same recommendation, really, that we should focus much more strongly on particular people rather than on generally groups of people. And that helps children root their work in specific evidence, and it also helps overcome the problem that children themselves have limited life experience to draw on as an imaginative or empathetic resource. We've got to remember that some of the children we're working with are 12 or 13 years old. They will find it difficult to empathise with an adult in their own society, to think about what it means to have to get a mortgage, to raise a family, to plan a career. These are things that people simply haven't done when they were at secondary school, and therefore it's difficult to project themselves back into that situation. So the more we can focus on an individual and think about the issues and dilemmas they were confronting in their life, the more we can expect people to be able to judge that individual in relation to the criteria that are relevant. And we have to find out about their life, and we have to find out about the specifics. It's no good trying to teach about the generality of a class of people during a national movement or industrialization, and to generalize from that experience. So this all puts a lot of pressure on us in terms of formulating the right kinds of questions that will really open up the empathetic potential of those primary sources. So that emerges in several authors' work. The important thing is, I think, that you need to help the children think their way into a person and not put themselves into that person's position, because that way we just create anachronistic judgments in which people impose today's reasoning and worldview on people in the past who simply didn't have access to that way of thinking about the world. So as Cunningham might note in the other article that you're looking at for this week, third person questioning, what would they think, might be more powerful than second person questioning, what would you think? Now, Cunningham talks about teachers who kind of slide between the two positions. But if you think about this in relation to what we're ultimately driving at, it seems to me that it's clearer to be upfront with children from the very beginning and say, I want you to tell me what those people in the past would have thought, or that person in the past thought about this situation, and here are the clues in this primary evidence we've got. So we can't come up with a set of generic questions we can apply in every empathetic piece of work or project. We need to construct carefully worded questions which specifically relate to the potential in the sources that we're using in a particular inquiry. The other thing they talk about, Endicott and Brooks, that is that once you've done some of that work about empathizing through the sources, you then need to create some kind of task through which the children can present their empathetic understanding. So as with the questions, the tasks require children to assume a first person voice tends to encourage, they say, a more simplistic projection of themselves back into time. So if you ask someone to present a role play in which they talk about I projecting back in time, you're more likely to get the child's perspective just overlaid onto a historical gloss of their contextual understanding. So Endicott and Brooks say activities which encourage them to use the third person, he, she or they, are more likely to engage that student in understanding there's a difference, there's a distance between them and the person with whom they're empathising. And then that encourages them to see the historical person in their own terms. So there's a clear tension here, and there's a balance I think you need to bear in mind when you're devising activities, which is that some of the most powerful empathetic activities, such as role plays and debates, work best when you are talking in the first person, when you are trying to inhabit that role. But as Endicott and Brooks point out, that brings a certain risk with it, that you just simply anachronistically project yourself back in time. So with that warning about trying to avoid first person presentism, these are the kinds of common activities that emerge from people talking about teaching empathetically. So we can initiate role plays and debating. We can have hot seating, that kind of drama activity where people take it in turns to play roles and respond as another person. We can generate essays where we write about people and their motivations. We can create fictionalized diary extracts or letters or poems from other people's perspectives. Another suggestion was to create a museum display which explores individual people's motivations. Something I've used in teaching is prediction activities. So set the scene for a character who had some important decisions to make, then set out several possible things they could have chosen to do, and ask the children to think about what's the one they think is going to happen, or even to set themselves up as advisors. So you give your advice, and then you create the classroom as a kind of a chamber in which the advice is received by the historical character, and people can test their advice against each other, and they can critique each other's bits of advice using contextual understanding. So I think that kind of predictive activity enables you as the teacher to set the scene very clearly, because you direct children to a context that you've written. You set the dilemma that an individual may have been facing in relation to the context, so you've constructed some very clear lines around which you want the children to reason and think, and then you've also restricted to some extent the possible routes of action that they're going to think about. So all they're really doing is just thinking about what's the most realistic given the information they have. And then finally, a slightly more open-ended form of simulation games where you just encourage children to think more openly about the kinds of options available to people or how they might have responded if they were in the same context. So the kinds of advice that emerges from the literature. Rob Phillips in his book advises that we may be able to maintain students' focus on the historical dimension and to avoid that first person presentism or the anachronism by providing very clear guidance on the following three aspects. So he says, first of all, we need to give the children guidance on context, ensure they have enough background knowledge and access to resources, and that we make the link between the empathetic activities and use of that contextual information. The second is very straightforward really, and he says when setting the purpose or clarifying the purpose, we just need to emphasise that the learning intention is to express the views of other people, not imagine yourself in that position. So he's saying if we can see from the research that there is a risk if you set up an activity that's in the first person and I am talking about me and imagining myself in a historical situation, one of the ways you can avoid that becoming anachronistic is to warn children about the problems of anachronism and then encourage them to avoid that. So just by being very clear about the pitfalls and warning children not to fall into those traps, we minimise the chance that that's the kind of vague, unhistorical thinking that we see in the classroom. And then finally, he says it's really important to structure the kinds of activities realistically. That helps the children engage with those activities more seriously. Foster adds some more advice, and he says it's really useful if we can focus on puzzling and paradoxical situations, because they really feed off this notion of motivating the students and using this approach to draw students into the learning. The second thing he says is reiterating this notion of questioning, and he says we need to really kind of encourage critical questioning of sources to avoid a simplistic reading, that we need to encourage students to think about sources at a higher, more general level, so we encourage them to think about how and why the sources are useful in shedding light on the past. So they're interpreting an individual source and then they're talking about the usefulness of that source in the context of an investigation, which is a kind of more general, higher level form of engagement with sources. And the other thing he says, which I think is really important, is to dedicate enough time to develop empathy as a deep engagement. So we shouldn't think about empathetic activities as a short activity that we can tack on to the end of another lesson. So we don't just do some source work and then just stick a role play on the end of the lesson because it's an interesting way to finish, because that ends up being superficial. Everything that comes through the literature about historical empathy is it's complicated, it's nuanced, that children especially need a fair bit of time to really engage with the detail so that they can avoid a superficial performance in an activity, and therefore we should make sure we dedicate enough time in our planning to planning empathetic work rather than just use it as a quick activity for variety. The third bit of advice comes from Seng and Wei, who were writing about using this in the classroom in Singapore. They said they thought it was important to be able to consider the intent and the message of a historical source and not just to describe its content. It's important for helping students to think about the past imaginatively and empathetically, to think about what the source tells you, what we can infer from it, and why that source is useful. So there are almost three different ways of reasoning about sources, and they're reflecting on fairly recent social changes in patterns of housing in their society, but still thinking that it's thinking about how to encourage empathy has really helped them to sharpen up their appreciation of how you need to engage with sources at these three levels. And this obviously links back to what we were saying about the use of sources and the interpretation of sources in the last lecture, where we were saying for those purposes we need to move beyond sources as information and move into sources as evidence about broader inquiry. So we're not just reading them literally, we're trying to go beyond the surface of the information we can glean from them. Schmilt had some more advice, and I really like this as a potential framework to use in the classroom. This problem, especially with younger children, I think, is that when you've opened up the potential of historical imagination, that although theoretically, as husbands would have pointed out, that we can avoid flights of fancy by rooting things in the source work, it's also important to have other criteria to encourage children to make a balanced judgment about whether these are realistic interpretations of people's motivations. And Schmilt provides these four criteria. First is coherence, that any account we come up with has to be a convincing account. It can't be completely fanciful. Second, consonance, that it has to be seen to fit into its historical context, so we can judge each other's interpretations using the historical contextual knowledge that we have. Efficiency, it has to take account of a range of available evidence. We can't just base an entire interpretation of someone's motivation on one piece of evidence. And parsimony, that there shouldn't be a more obvious alternative explanation, so we should try and limit the flights of fancy. That, for any action someone takes, there might be thousands of possible reasons for it, including divine inspiration, but we wouldn't leap to divine inspiration if there was a more mundane, everyday, accessible reason behind someone's motivation. So we have to kind of judge it in realistic terms and think about what are the more everyday assumptions that people would make in their lives. So obviously the language in which this is couched would be difficult to use with younger children, but I think that idea of having some rules of thumb that you could use to encourage children to review each other's theories, and that you could use to feed back on their theories about how realistic you find them as interpretations, is a useful way of developing that shared sense of how we check the credibility of historical accounts and how we move away from this notion that imagination is just completely free, that it is always held in check by some form of judgment. And I think these are four useful criteria for making those judgments. So these are some of the references that I've drawn on to glean these practice-based ideas for the classroom. In the last short part of the lecture, I'm going to just share some thoughts about the reading very briefly, and then say something about the activities that I think you could usefully undertake for the task this